Hello, and thank you for joining us. Welcome from me, Michael Scott in Oxford in the UK, and from my joint convener, Sanford J. Ungar in Washington, DC, to the 52nd jointly promoted event between the Future of the Humanities Project and the Free Speech Project. The latter is sponsored by Georgetown University and the former by Georgetown's Humanities Initiative in association with Campion Hall, Oxford, and the Las Casas Institute for Social Justice at Blackfriars Hall, Oxford. Together, the two projects consider issues concerning human dignity, rights, cultures, histories, traditions, and freedoms in a wide spectrum of educational activity, policy, expression, and aspiration. In a moment, I'll hand over to Sandy, who is the director of the Free Speech Project. He will introduce today's distinguished guests and moderate the ensuing discussion before I return to chair the question and answer session. From the start, you can type in questions to the panel by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Please use the Q&A button, not the chat button. These questions will come to me during the session, and I will try and put them to the panel to consider. We urge you to ask questions as and when they occur to you so that there is not a bottleneck at the end. I'll now disappear, but I'll be listening to the discussion and coming back in about 40 minutes. Over to you, Sandy.
Thanks very much, Mike, and welcome to everybody joining us from wherever you are in the US and the UK and often many other countries as well. I'll just briefly introduce our panelists. You've probably seen material about them in our invitations to this program. John Bensimer directs a cyber AI project and is a senior fellow at Georgetown Center for Security and Emerging Technology, an adjunct professor at the School of Foreign Service here at Georgetown. And just from his job titles, it sounds like he ought to know quite a lot about our subject today. Mara Grossman, on the other hand, is a research professor in the School of Computer Science at the University of Waterloo in Ontario in Canada, and an adjunct professor as well at Osgoode Hall Law School in Toronto, and an affiliate faculty member at the Vector Institute, all based in Ontario. Howard Robinson is a senior research fellow at Blackfriars Hall in Oxford, has taught philosophy at Oriel College, Oxford, Liverpool University, and other places around the world. He's professor emeritus at the Central European University, which is an interesting qualification because it was a very key institution in the days following the end of the Cold War. Maggie Savin-Baden, a senior research fellow also at Blackfriars Hall, earned a PhD from the University of London and an MSc in e-learning from the University of Edinburgh. So she's got a head start with e-learning, and we're very glad to have her with us as well. She works closely with Mike Scott at Oxford. So I want to begin with a very basic question, and I'm going to address it to Howard Robinson, who, as a philosopher, I think does not surprise us by wondering about this. But basically the question is, by its very name, artificial intelligence, one is inclined to believe that AI itself has intelligence, that it has a mind or some replica of a brain and an ability to think, that it's a force, some would say, out of science fiction. And Howard, I wonder what your ruminations about that might be, and then maybe some of the other panelists will join. We've got much more to talk about after that.
Yeah, I asked, I think, 3 of my colleagues at Oriel College. One was the vice provost, and one was a junior research fellow, and the other a graduate student who did some teaching, all computer scientists in the department in Oxford, whether they thought Chatbox and co were thinking, and they laughed. And they didn't say, we're not there yet. They said, well, the kind of thing these things do is nothing to do with what we think of as thinking. And the reason for that, the chap at New York produced some arguments about this as well, the computer scientist. You just get as many texts as you can. And then when somebody puts some text in, this machine works out which symbols usually come next. It's got nothing to do with understanding what's been said at all or put in. And as it were, and thinking about it, it's just a question of putting out the symbols, which according to the body of data you've got, are the symbols that usually are most likely to come after the ones you've just received. And if we're discussing things, that's not the way. Maybe my brain makes a contribution a bit like that. But that's not, when I'm responding to what I think you mean, or if you're responding to what you think I mean, you're not just sorting out which kinds of noises are appropriate to come next. So it's nothing to do with thinking, it's nothing to do with understanding the meanings or anything of that sort. And the connection between meanings, you get it best in the Meno, really. Once you've got an idea, you can see what ideas it connects with. And that's not just because of association. It's because you're grasping the content and how those contents might relate to something else. So it's not thinking at all. The question of whether it's useful or a threat, or it's like any machinery, can it get out of hand? But I don't think it's got anything to do with it having thoughts of its own in our sense. That's my.
So we don't have to worry about it taking over from us, in other words.
Except by accident.
Right, that's a different question. That's an entirely different question.
Right. Well, Maura, how about you? What do you think are the overall primary benefits of artificial intelligence? And you have some thoughts about what the major concerns are as well.
Sure. Well, I'll agree with Howard that it's your first question is like asking, is your calculator alive? And the answer to that is no. It can do lots of calculations and computations. AI can do pattern recognition, probabilities, predictions, but it's not thinking like a human would think. That said, there are many things that it can do because it can process information at speeds that people can't and at volumes that people can't. For example, it can develop new medications by trying sort of every permutation and combination of various ingredients. So it's not thought, but that doesn't mean it isn't going to be inventive or add value. It is certainly going to add efficiency. And it also depends here whether we're talking about AI in general or we're talking about generative AI, which generates language or video or audio. Risks, the risks are tremendous from things we experience today, like bias and privacy violations and security violations, all the way up to loss of control. And I'm not thinking about science fiction making us all into paper clips kind of thing. What I'm thinking about is if you take an AI agent and you give it access to your credit card, it can do things, and it can do things that maybe you would not approve of or you would not do. And so I worry about controls as these tools become more autonomous. If we give them an unlimited amount of electricity and they can't be shut off, or we give them access to money and credit cards, or if we give them weapons, that's a pretty dangerous combination. And we're well on our way to at least 2 out of 3 of those. So that's my
Well,
vote.
that's sobering. I must say the electricity issue seems to have emerged as a very important one, and that will be the subject of our next international dialogue next month in March. Where is the world going to find all this electricity we now need? But John Bensemer, do you have anything reassuring to say? I think some quite alarming possibilities have already been raised.
So I probably do on a couple of different aspects. So first of all, what Howard described in terms of generative AI capabilities and those types of pieces, I would agree. However, when we think about artificial intelligence and the variety of different capabilities that are out there, they are already at superhuman capabilities in some domains, right? Whether or not that is this similar to human intelligence is I think much more a matter of debate. But AlphaGo and reinforcement learning capabilities that enabled it to become the world champion Go player and then self-teach itself very, very quickly to become even better in 2016, 2017, that was a shock to the world at the time. But now we've moved on to something else, right? We've moved on to generative AI. But I'm really glad you asked the question because sometimes I do think that we get a little bit too down on AI when there's actually some pretty good applications out there that we don't think that kind of run in the background, right? So, for example, much of cybersecurity is powered by artificial intelligence systems that are very good at anomaly detection, pattern recognition that Maura talked about, and other types of things. The reason that we don't have as much spam in our boxes as we used to is largely because of machine learning kind of capabilities. So those things have improved. We've also seen challenges from the past, facial recognition systems that were incredibly biased at the beginning, that have improved substantively over time through a mixture of recognizing what the initial challenges were, vendor test of those systems to remove some of those racial and gender biases that existed, and they become much better. So it's not all kind of gloom and doom, but we still have plenty of work to do, and the generative AI piece is kind of the frontier right now, so to speak.
Just to divert you for a second, how did some of those biases and some of those flaws, A, how did they develop, and B, how did they get detected?
So they developed predominantly because the training data that was used to build facial recognition algorithms was not representative of the human population, right? It represented people that looked more like me than the world population. And so it was resolved by creating a much more diverse data set. And I wouldn't say it's fully resolved, but it is certainly many of those differentials have been reduced substantively. The second piece is, I would say, a combination of academics that kind of found these kind of biases, as well as reporting, some really good reporting that also demonstrated just kind of the negative kind of societal impacts of facial recognition systems that could cause societal harm.
Thank you for that explanation. I must say, representing only myself, that therein lies a rather persuasive argument in favor of thinking about diversity and certainly not banning people from thinking about diversity in an intellectual environment. I'm not asking you to respond to that. I just, it occurs to me that it's something that we in this country have to worry seriously about at the moment. Maggie, what kinds of regulation, if any, do you suppose might be needed? Is this European Act, the AI Act, I gather it's called the European Union's law, is that going in the right direction?
Well, it's aspirational is probably the politest way of putting it. I think it's almost for me like shutting the door before the whole horse has bolted. It's or after the horse has bolted. I think the problem with it is that the timelines are too long. It won't be implemented for at least another 2 years, and you can already see when you look at ChatGPT and then you look at deepfake, the speed at which things are changing is too fast for the laws. And even things like facial recognition software, certainly in London, we have huge problems with facial recognition because in certain areas of London where we have very large Black populations, it's people like Big Brother Watch who study this are really concerned, and the way that it's being used illegally, certainly by our police. I don't know about that in the US. So I think some of the regulation is not good enough. Some of it is too late. And I think some of it, I mean, John is better on security than I am, but I noticed that in the Paris summit, neither the UK or the US were prepared to sign the agreement with other world leaders about the future of AI, because the global security was not strong enough in what was being proposed.
When was that agreement signed, more or less?
It was February. It was this month. It was
Oh, was
earlier
this
this
month?
month. Yeah,
A
Australia
week or
and
two
China.
ago, it was very recent.
Yeah, it was last week, I think. But nobody, the US and the UK would not sign the
But my
agreement.
understanding was that the US and the UK wouldn't sign because they don't want regulation. They want to be able to innovate more. But that was
That was
my
the,
understanding,
well,
that was
our
the
press,
US. Yeah.
our press have reported that that's what the US said, but it was to the UK perspective was it was to do with inadequacy in the global security. But again, I don't know the US security like John does, so I don't know. I only really know what I can read in the legal stuff here.
Yeah, no, our press reported it quite differently. They were saying that it was the change in the administration, the current administration's view towards regulation in general, and a rolling back of the Biden era regulation, and a disagreement with the approach that the EU has been taking.
So as with so many things at this very moment in political history, there can be some confusion of motives about why some of these positions are being taken. Mara, in a note to the others of us the other day, you said something very interesting about whether AI can do something about deep fakes, and I wonder if you would explain what you have, excuse me, what you have in mind in raising that question.
Sure. So when I teach computer science students about law, ethics, and policy and the implications of what they're building, and one of the questions I will often ask are, what are the benefits of this technology and what are the burdens or the drawbacks? And I sometimes scratch my head with deepfakes because we can clearly see some of the problems that that this particular technology brings, and not the least of which is the democratization of fraud. I mean, now anybody can make something fraudulent for free in 2 seconds. I can take Howard's voice. We probably got enough of it already. So the non-consensual intimate images, the interference with elections, and the disinformation. And then, yes, there are positives, parody, some creative stuff, but I wonder, going back to Maggie's point about regulation, how do you regulate something like deepfakes, which are going to create utter havoc for the courts and maybe democracy itself? On the one hand, to say you can't do this is an incursion on free speech, but on the other hand, I just don't see the benefits of this technology outweighing right now the liabilities and the harm.
Well, you just raised an interesting question about parody and satire, and one of the questions that we've raised from time to time in the Free Speech Project, or I teach about free speech here at Georgetown, is whether satire is still something we can live with, something we can handle. and whether some kind of interpretation of what's good for society overall might wipe out satire, might challenge comedy, might make us all serious to the point of well, not necessarily desirable personalities.
I'd like to hear Howard's take on this.
Howard?
Well, interesting thought. I've been wondering recently, and I'd say wondering rather than thinking, because I haven't been doing anything serious intellectual work on it and wouldn't know how to, whether satire actually contributes to serious discussion. I've enjoyed satire right from that this week that was, and the news quiz now, and some of the wonderful stuff you get in the American television, taking Trump to pieces. But I think Mrs. Thatcher liked Spitting Image, even though it was largely mocking her. And I wonder when before satire became so popular in the 50s, whether there was any less serious political discussion, and whether mocking and laughing at things actually makes any more serious points than a straightforward debate. And so I wouldn't like to.
We can go back to Jonathan Swift and say,
right, no, yeah, it's got to be making a point in a pungent way which it wouldn't be made otherwise. And I think a lot of satire where you've just got to take the mickey out of everything isn't really pointing at something that you wouldn't otherwise notice.
But what good thing can come of my taking Maggie's likeness and faking her voice and faking a video and having her say something she didn't say? I mean, what great contributions to.
Exactly, it doesn't. And when you said it'd be limiting free speech, faking things has never been part of freedom, is it? I mean, if you fake something pretending it's something else, you're cheating.
well, some of us think it's not part of it, but there are people who believe that absolutely anything goes, and if there are problems, then we fix them.
But I do think satire is really important to society, and it's really important to free speech. And I think if you do go back to when you first mentioned it, I was thinking about Spitting Image, the program in the BBC, and also things like Yes Minister, because what they did was they raised concerns about the way the Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher was treating her cabinet, and it raised questions about the inadequacy and the chaos that really does occur within the government that nobody sees. So I think it does raise important questions. Satire is important. Take Shakespeare, the amount of satire, the number of fools in Shakespeare, I think it's really important.
John Bensimer?
Yeah, I tend to align with Maggie on this. I would hate to think of a world without some degree of satire. We've talked about the British shows, so SNL just had their 50th anniversary, and that's largely based on satire as well. So there's quite a demand, at least, or a sustained demand for 50 years, for at least for some aspects of satire. But there's two other points that I would like to kind of touch on, right? Which is the underlying technology that enables deep fakes, which is basically synthetic data, right? And generative types of capabilities, is used in other aspects that are not nearly as damaging, right? So we want to be able to create synthetic data for things like training robotic systems in a safe environment and to train them more quickly. We already have some laws, right, that protect people from false likeness and those types of pieces. And so we are going to have to leverage those pieces. I think it becomes really, really hard to regulate certain aspects when the underlying technology is actually kind of the same piece. So you have to actually be much more targeted in terms of what would actually be regulated. And obviously causing harm to individuals would be one area that I shouldn't say obviously, but to me it seems rather obvious that we shouldn't allow those types of activities to occur.
And causing harm to another certainly does raise some questions about absolute free speech without any guardrails, without any, and so that's my next question is, can one put guardrails on artificial intelligence and what it does without sort of ruining the whole idea, without making it not worth all that electricity and
Well,
and all
isn't
that
that the
investment?
debate between like Elon Musk and Grok, which has much fewer guardrails than something like OpenAI. So Grok will give you answers that OpenAI to ChatGPT wouldn't, because ChatGPT's been cleaned up with reinforcement learning and to not say certain things. And that's a huge debate right now in the US. A lot of big tech has gotten rid of the content moderation. And that's a really important question. Do we want big tech doing content moderation? On the other hand, I can't approve of hate speech, and some of the things that people say on the internet because they're anonymous that are really just unacceptable. But where you draw these lines, that is an impossible question.
I gather
That
the
is a,
impression
I'm
that
sorry, please go ahead, Howard.
the Chinese ones rule out any mention of Tiananmen Square.
Right.
That's not a content moderation that one would particularly want. So it's
So they clean up history, as it were.
no.
And that would not be a great service to humanity to clean up history. What about this Chinese version? It's called
DeepSeek.
Deep
DeepSeek.
DeepSeek. Yep.
Yes. Well, how? I just actually accidentally said deep sink instead of seek. How does it differ from the American version? And will competition between those two versions have an impact on other matters that are of concern to us? I don't know who
So
wants to.
maybe I can start on this one, and I'll talk more on kind of some of maybe the technical differences,
Please, yes.
and what it may mean. So
And let
DeepSeek,
me, before you go into it, let me remind the audience that this would be a good time to use that Q&A button at the bottom and put in any questions or comments you might have. Sorry to interrupt you, John. Please go
no,
ahead.
that's fine. It's fine. So DeepSeek released a model. It's a Chinese model. They actually built a couple. So it was they created one that was much more closely kind of the traditional kind of ChatGPT type, and then they created a second one that was even more powerful and capable. They used a variety of different kind of innovations, and they also used far less computing power than we have seen in some of the largest models that have been built in the United States. That may have implications for your panel next week in terms of just electrical generation and those types of things.
All right.
But the other piece is that they instead of creating one extraordinarily large model, they used what's called a mixture of experts model, which is kind of breaking it up into smaller pieces, which actually makes the training in those types of pieces a little bit easier and a little bit faster, and not quite as expensive. I think the most controversial piece was that at least there's some speculation in terms of how it was trained at the very end, in terms of taking prompts from other very capable models and then using that as the final training data. It's called distillation. And where did that data come from and those types of pieces. But regardless of where it came from, it created a really powerful model. And we saw kind of the paradigm of just continuing to scale up and scale up being challenged a little bit. I don't think that we're out of this kind of scaling paradigm in terms of making models larger, but it did create some suggestion that things have changed a little bit in that regard. So it is a capable model, very capable model, and one that I think deserves watching. And it shows that China is innovating and taking kind of slightly different pathways than the United States model. Last point on this is it is also released publicly. It is an open model. So Maura was talking about Grok, another open model. Meta produces open models, and then there are closed models like ChatGPT, like Claude. Those are closed models that have guardrails around them and are more protected. You can't just download kind of the blueprint for that model on a closed model. Whereas with an open model, anyone can download that model and use it if they have enough computing power.
I
So I
think,
can't help but ask you. Oh, I'm sorry. You go ahead first, Maura, please.
I was going to say, I think what was so surprising to everybody, John said, in the United States, at least, we were focused on scaling, more compute power, more data. But the US may have inadvertently sort of invited this competition because we were restricting the export of these very, very large chips that we were not letting China have. So they figured how to innovate around getting those super large chips from NVIDIA that they were blocked from getting. And that's what shocked everybody is they did more or they did the same with a lot less compute. Now, whether they copied some other stuff, we don't know. There's been lots of debate on that. But back to your question about competition, I actually think that's a good thing, not a bad thing, that it caused them to think a little bit differently about the problem, and it shook the markets because I think everybody got concerned about these billions and billions of dollars that were being invested in these plants and building, bigger nuclear plants and all kinds of things, like to have more energy and more training of data and so forth. And it showed, well, maybe there's another way to go about this. So
But I think the other thing that's not discussed about these large language models like ChatGPT is that the data is stolen. So there's very little that's discussed about the ethics behind all of this. And I think that's a constant worry. So not only the environmental impact, but where the data has been scraped from.
Well, that's a very interesting point. Howard, will the ethicists be waking up and talking about this sometime soon?
Should be, not that I am an ethicist, but Cambridge University Press, I think, we're asking my permission to use my 2016 book to be put into something like that. And I've just not got round to saying yes, because I don't want to say yes. I don't want to help these things to work. Not that there's any dangerous material in my book. I don't think there's a lot of truth, but
No, but
But it's yours.
it's mine.
The minute it's in there, how would you lose your copyright? It's gone. And that's the kind of ethical questions that people are just not dealing with.
So I actually lose the legal copyright.
Yeah, you lose the legal
the courts
copyright.
are. Yeah.
Yeah. Once
Well,
it's in there.
Never given my permission, and I don't. Whether CUP have just done it because they do, I've not the faintest idea. But I certainly haven't given my permission.
I'm currently writing a book on realistic and ethical use of AI, so I'm dealing with some of that stuff.
It sounds like it's needed. The discussion of the Chinese model caused me to think somewhat mischievously, I think, is how long will it be before members of Congress, members of Parliament, governors, etc., are warning about the Chinese model of AI the way they did about TikTok and this incredible frenzy about TikTok as if it were a very evil thing. I have students who think it's not an evil thing at all, but a very constructive thing. And then lo and behold, we have someone who got elected president who was very much against it, but suddenly decided he liked it. And we don't really know why, and it's not the subject of today's program, but
There's
it-
already concerns. You've already got some state governments that have said that the employees may not use it. With the open source version, all that information is going back to China in the same way that all the information on TikTok does. And so we did see in the United States, at least, OpenAI made a deal with the federal government, and now there is an OpenAI tool that is being made accessible to government employees. But there's already been movement and warnings against use of the tools for any personal information, any proprietary information, anything like that.
But how really does one enforce a ban on using information like that? How do you?
I
how
don't
can
think
one-
you I don't think you can, because the minute there were machinations about banning TikTok, certainly most of the Americans in my son's generation, he's 22, started using the Chinese version of TikTok, which opened the US to actually probably more damage than the current version of TikTok.
I
Well,
guess it
that's a
depends who
striking
supplies
fact.
your phone or your computer. If the government has supplied it to you, they can control what you download. They can't control what you download on your own personal phone.
Mm.
Well,
What
but I
what
think-
you're touching on is what everyone is touching on is kind of an open source ecosystem. So, you know, if we want to look at analogs, we can go back to kind of the open source ecosystem that creates lots and lots of code that is freely downloadable, and used. And it's not only DeepSeek, right? There are literally hundreds of models, open source models that individuals can download and use. Some are more capable than others. Many of them will spew the toxic content that we're worried about. But they are available. And I do think that trying to regulate that, let's put it this way. I can't figure out a way that how that could be regulated. I would hope maybe this esteemed panel has ideas, but I don't know how you would regulate that.
Anyone have any thoughts about how to regulate it? Maggie?
No, because as I say, you know, everybody who was on TikTok moved over to RedNote, and it would appear to me that the Chinese version of TikTok, RedNote, is more dangerous. You know, if we're trying to stop infiltration,
I guess you could
John
control the
hasn't got a
appetite.
single idea how to do it. I think we're stuck.
Maybe you control the people who provide the apps, and that's what they were doing with TikTok, is they were saying to Apple and Google, you can't make it available in your store. So if it's not available in the store to download, I suppose you can download it from somewhere else, but
You can.
Yeah.
And that's the challenge on the models themselves, is they're not even apps necessarily. These are, you can just, you're in essence building you're downloading the weights of a model, which are just kind of, think of it as kind of the architecture of that particular model. You can download that off of any number of websites, not even going to kind of something that has like a store where you can download apps. So I think it's even more challenging in that respect.
So it's
But
an
once you download
illusion
it,
of
isn't it on-
regulation.
yeah. Isn't it on your system, John, though? Once you download it, it's not sending the information back to China then.
That's correct. If you got one that's small enough that you could load on your own, but some of them would be larger, right? Yeah. So it depends on what size of model that someone is downloading, what compute that they have available to actually execute those larger models would require more compute, et cetera.
And
But it's a thorny challenge, so I don't think we're going to solve it
Yeah.
today.
I mean, I wonder whether we're looking at this the wrong way. I wonder whether instead of regulation, we should be actually talking about values and ethics, so that we shift away from just trying to fix and rule by law, and instead talk about acceptable behavior and argue against scapegoating and grandstanding and those types of behavior, which and hate speech, as Maura's mentioned, that maybe that's a better way to go than trying to regulate everything.
Maggie, I'm so glad you said that. And because I do think that we are just going to have to adapt to a different environment. And that adaptation means that there's going to be far more generated content. That is pretty hard to distinguish between human generated content and synthetic content. There's just going to be a lot more of it. And somehow we are going to have to adapt. And how do we adapt? We can adapt through kind of normative processes. We can adapt through better education early on, teaching kind of critical reasoning skills early on in our elementary schools and secondary schools, et cetera. So those types of aspects, I think, are going to be at least as critical and maybe more powerful over the long term in terms of how we adapt to kind of a new situation that we all face.
it's such a quaint suggestion at this particular moment in human history to teach critical reasoning skills. It doesn't seem like a lot of people would be choosing that course at the moment, although they should be. If it were an option, I agree with you, John. One last question before we go to Mike, and if there are anyone else who has comments you want to put into the Q&A button, now is the good time to do it. What is it that we are or should be afraid the Chinese or other people we consider adversaries, which is a whole separate issue? We're very good at choosing adversaries. I'm not sure we're good at explaining why they're adversaries, but what is it that we're afraid they'll get? Or that is it going to set off another frenzy like the TikTok thing, which has ended up ironically not happening? I mean, not being regulated after all at this moment. What would people get from Chinese, and what would the Chinese get from American AI? Is what I'm asking.
Weapons. I think that's the military applications are
I
what
see.
scare most people, is that warfare won't be done with armies in your own country. You can send a swarm of drones somewhere else, or do all kinds of cyber, just attack somebody's entire electrical grid or banking system or whatever. I think that's part of it. And the other part is what we often call goal alignment, that I agree with Maggie that we should be having these discussions about what is acceptable behavior, but take the United States as a case in point. What is acceptable behavior has changed drastically in the last year. So that, that can change very easily, and that may differ in different countries about, what is more valued than, is free speech more valued, or do we want more polite speech, or,
Good luck. Okay, Mike Scott, you're there somewhere.
I am.
And I wonder if you want to pick up now. This group of people can certainly proceed on this. There's lots more to say. This has been a wonderful discussion.
Yeah, I've been fascinated by it. John Alto says, in his book Nexus, Harari describes information networks created between computers exclusively that will be a complete mystery to humans. Does his vision ring true to the panel? Is that where we're going? It's going to be a complete mystery to humans.
I think the
John.
idea, I
Oh,
think the
sorry, go on
idea,
then, Maggie. Go on, yeah.
I was going to just say, I think the idea of the network state is going to be more of a reality than what Harari is suggesting. And I think that that's what you're beginning to see in the behavior of the current US administration.
I also think if you look at, for example, deep learning, we already don't know. We know what the input is. We know what the output is. We know there are a whole bunch of hidden layers doing things in the middle, but we don't, the computer scientists can't explain to you exactly what's going on there. And I think these systems may get more and more complicated. That doesn't mean we can't test them, validate them, verify them. But understanding them, I think, is going to become much, much harder, especially as systems interact. So Howard has his agent acting on his behalf, and I have my agent acting on my behalf, and then the two of them interact, and all kinds of unpredictable new things can happen, as multiple networks come together.
Hmm.
Howard, you want some comments on
I
this?
just went, I didn't say anything. I really have no idea about this technical side of it and how it.
Okay, John, sorry, I'll move to
So,
John then.
yeah. First of all, I would say, obviously, it's speculative, right? I mean, I think where we move into this area becomes much more speculative. Harari has also talked about the fact that that our brains are nothing more than an algorithm as well, right? How our neurons fire, how our synapses fire, and how they work together, I think, is still somewhat inscrutable. At least it is to me. And so, what my understanding of Harari's piece, and maybe you'll need to get him on the panel at some other point, but is this concept of, if a system becomes sufficiently intelligent, an artificial intelligence system becomes sufficiently intelligent, this is the AGI piece, that it would be far, far more intelligent, it would be super intelligent, and far, far more intelligent than humans are at this moment. And so that we would no longer be the dominant species on Earth. We would be subservient in some respects, and certainly would make it much more inscrutable, just like it's impossible for an animal to kind of understand how we reason in the world. That's what I think his premise is. And I'd say it's possible, but we're not, I don't see that pathway at this moment.
Okay, anybody else on that? Let's move on then. Just something else that has come in elsewhere. We had a situation across the West recently with elections in France, in Britain, in the US. Why did the predictions of the election not exactly ally with the actual results of the elections, if both the people who did the predictions and the people who gave the results were using AI?
I'll take a stab at this one. It used to be that you could ask people how they were going to vote, and you could rely on their answer. And therefore, you could do statistics, assuming you got a representative sample, and compute. I can only talk for the last US election. I'm not sure that holds anymore, that what people will say publicly and what they do when they step into a very private space align. So I think that's part of why we can't predict the behavior anymore, because we're not getting accurate enough signals to be able to do the statistics properly, because people behave differently than they tell you they're going to behave. You're going to be wrong in your predictions. Your predictions will be no better than your data, and the data is flawed at this point, at least as to the U.S. elections, I think.
Yeah, yeah, I can understand that. We had a whole time in the UK when nobody would admit that they voted for Margaret Thatcher. You know, you went through that kind of period. Perhaps you get the same thing in elections elsewhere. Ted Kennedy writes, how much sympathy does the panel have with the concerns of performing musicians, for example, about the harvesting of their output without paying royalties? Can that happen with music?
Completely sympathetic, and the same with artists. That it's stolen data, and I think it's immoral and it's wrong.
I did a study. We were about to publish it. We've submitted it, where we interviewed fiction writers. And the level of distress within that group and the amount of betrayal that they feel is staggering, because they do what they do because they love it, and because they feel like they're sharing something very personal when they write. And all of a sudden, they were already in a field where most of them could not support themselves. They had to have other jobs in addition to their writing, and now they feel even that's been taken away. So we were stunned at the level of anger and animosity and frustration and despair that the people we interviewed expressed.
Certainly in the UK, that there is legislation to support authors, and certainly the publishers that I publish with will not allow AI to be used and not allow AI images. So they're very clear on that.
But how do they know? I mean,
well, because you're not allowed to use an AI image within a book or on the front of a book. And I haven't read the trade bodies issue, but they've recently issued a joint statement on stolen data.
is that the same in the US? John, do you know?
I do not know. I haven't heard of that. I haven't tracked that aspect of it. What I can say is it's becoming more and more difficult to be able to these systems have had profound improvements over the last 4 to 5 years. And so distinguishing between an AI generated image and a human generated one, particularly in digital format, is becoming harder and harder. Sometimes they're artifacts, sometimes they're not. It can become really, really challenging. We will have to look at other technologies to kind of protect kind of that initial kind of human generated form, I think, over time.
Yeah, in the US, it hasn't been regulation. It's been working its way through the courts, through suits over infringement and scraping.
There's another question that relates to that, which is, what can anyone do if the information that's going through AI is incorrect? Could the writer of false information be prosecuted? I suppose it goes back to the other question, the political question. What about if a political party put incorrect information through about the result of the election, and it's incorrect? That somehow they've got control. What do we do then?
Well, I intervene on that from a Platonistic point of view.
Oh, okay.
Seems to me,
I thought Plato would come in at one point. Yeah.
it's a constitutional Platonism. Unless there is a weighting towards intelligence in the kind of votes that people have and the number of votes they have, you're bound to get the cunning Philistines and the stupid Philistines as in Fox News and the people who own Fox News, conspiring together against intelligence. And there's nothing you can do about that. And only if there's a weighting, that great conservative English gentleman, politician Clem Attlee, the worst things he did was to get rid of the university seats, which we should now have had about 60 or 70 of them. It's only that kind of weighting that can that can make it possible for people to see through rubbish. Otherwise, they rush to believe in rubbish. Now, it's too late to do anything about that, but I don't see what you could do about it, because people want to believe that the kind of stuff they're told. Pessimistic thought.
Yeah.
I agree, there's not much we can do about that. I can't sue you for lying. I can sue you for fraud. I suppose if you're trying to sell me something and you misrepresent what it is, then I can sue you, but I can't sue you just for lying.
I only discovered recently the Duke of Wellington opposed the 1832 Reform Act because he thought that once you started that road, you'd end up with something like the French Revolution and then dictatorship or something like Napoleon. And of course he was wrong, because our development before then was not the same as French before 1780, but perhaps he just got his time scale wrong. We're now at that kind of point. And perhaps we can't unravel, I don't know, even by firing the sword.
I think there's hope, and maybe John has some thoughts on this. Right now, the tech isn't there. The watermarking, you can remove it, you can put a fake watermark on something. The tech just isn't there. I think maybe in a few years, there are standards that are being developed. There's something called C2PA in the United States, where we will mark everything at the provenance. When it is created, it will get some indelible stamp that will say who created it, when they created it, where they created it. And once that's on every single device and every computer, then we may have some hope of being able to tell what's real from what's not. But right now, I don't think the tech is there, and I don't think it's going to be there anytime soon.
To your point, Maura, I think the C2PA standard, a technical standard that people are trying to implement, in essence, allowing for knowing where the provenance of data is, I think is a good step forward. And it's those types of technical kind of mitigations that are going to be important going forward. However, it does require opt-in, right? I mean, you have to have a device that will allow this kind of signature to be applied, and you have to be willing to use it. So there's that piece of it. To the earlier question, Michael, the other part is, there's two kind of challenges here, right? I think what the question may have originally been was kind of deliberately putting in false information, but when you are, it is hard to describe just how much data is being downloaded to train these systems, right? And it can be pretty arbitrary. So it's almost inevitable that false data is going to be embedded into these systems. And so really what becomes is, can you get enough truthful data that when it's kind of creating that next word piece, that it actually gives you an accurate answer? I will say that what I have seen in using the systems, particularly the high-end systems, they are becoming much more accurate than they used to. So I do think we're starting to see a general climb to much more accurate, but it's certainly not foolproof by any stretch of the imagination. I would not, depending upon the context, you'd still have to be careful.
Yeah, I mean, this isn't a new thing, really. When you got the printing press and so on coming out, that came out, and you get the problem in my subject area, which is Shakespeare. You get the problem that the first quarter of Hamlet is not Hamlet. It's been stolen, and there are no copyright laws, so it's been stolen. So what do? They had to bring out the second quarter, which was the actual right script that had been used. I suppose you've just got to take time, but let's keep on the universities for a moment. and colleges and education. How, this is a practical question that has come in. How will universities, colleges, schools deal with the problem of students using AI in examinations or assessments? How do we know that what the assessment is, what we get in, is for assessment, is not just AI, that it's the student understands what they're put in?
You have them come and sit in front of you with no attachment to the internet, with a pen and paper, and write the exam. My students are definitely using these tools. There's no doubt. We run them through a detector, but the detectors have a lot of false positives and they make errors. But I said last year to one of my classes, because I felt I was getting so much back that was in an ethics class that was written by generative AI, that I said, I'm giving you 1 week amnesty if you used a tool to write your paper. Take the paper back, no questions asked. You have a week, submit a new paper. Half the class did.
One of the things that's happening in universities in the UK is that we're starting to address that by using different kinds of assessment. People are going back to the paper exam, but they're also using much more creative forms of assessment, and they're using peer assessment, and they're using video assessment and all sorts of things. So that there is a real shift to be more creative in how students are assessed, which I think is a great idea, so we get away from these millions of essays that you've read 12 times, and I think that that's a good thing. And there are plenty of very innovative and very creative assessments that can cut through this.
In one of my law classes, Maggie, I'm having people keep a journal, a personal journal. After class, they have to write an entry, because I figured that would be much harder since the Gen AI isn't attending the class and hearing the discussion. So.
Mike, may I interject a question here?
Yeah, go on.
Yeah, some of these last few comments make me raise a sort of cowardly question in a way. Is there going to be any way to opt out of all this? Is there any way to live in one's own created world with old-fashioned methods of assessment, old-fashioned methods of investigation and research and so on? Or are we all swept up on it, and if we don't like it, we should find another line of work? Can we withdraw?
John, what do you think of that?
I want to make sure I understand the premise of the question. Can we as individuals do it, or
Yeah.
can we, as individuals, I think most certainly we can, right? I mean, I have a hardcover book by my bed that I'm reading, right? So I mean, there's nothing that forces us to use these tools. These tools can actually be helpful in some regards, right?
Sure.
If you're just trying to try a search on the internet for a routine question, and then use one of the stronger tools, and I bet most people will probably like the results that come back from the tool better. But I do think that there is certainly an opt-out, and I think that there are, as Maggie and Maura talked about, there are certainly other types of assessments pieces too. We can have presentations in class. Communications, I think, is still a really important skill that we want our students to have.
Right.
And they're not there's no tether there to an AI system when somebody has to make a presentation. And so it's those types of kind of aspects that I do think allow us to continue to do this. The last point is we have to think about where these tools are okay to be used and where they're not. We had a big challenge, right, with calculators for a long time about how they were going to be used. And now you know, you can take them into an SAT or, you know, the kind of college preparatory course that we take. Couldn't do that when I went through, but you can now. So we have to say, okay, what are the limitations and start to define those, but we haven't established those norms yet. I think many institutions are still trying to figure out how to best do that. But I've really liked hearing some of these techniques from my fellow professors. It's wonderful.
But I do agree with Maggie that this horse is out of the barn. This is not, genie's not going back in the bottle anymore.
No, but we still have choice. People forget we have choice. And I mean, across the movies, people say, oh, I didn't have a choice. We do have a choice. We can turn our phones off. You know, we can turn our computers off. We could go for a walk in the countryside with no phone. We have choice. And I think it's easy to forget that we have choice.
If
It's a
you're,
good point, but
yeah.
what do you do? One final thing on about universities. What do you do about admissions? If people are putting in even videos, they can put in videos themselves, or they can even get questions if you're interviewing them online, in which the AI will give the answers, and they can have a split screen and they're reading off the answers as you're giving it. That's that fast. What do people do at the universities about that? It's a real problem. Maura?
It's not just the university. You mentioned the court system. I'm testifying and I've got the court on one side and I'm looking up stuff on the other. This is it's a real it's a real problem. For admissions, I suppose if everybody's using it, then it's fair. Then maybe you would be better off writing your own essay, because I don't know if you've read some of the stuff, but it's soulless. It doesn't communicate as I think John was saying, that communication is such an important skill. The stuff becomes so plain vanilla and watered down and generic. So maybe there's hope.
I think you have to have better interview questions. That's unique.
Yeah.
You need really difficult interview questions.
Yeah. And you have to do it in person.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah. Okay, I think we're going to have to wind it up there. I've got a feeling, Sandy, that we might be coming back to this topic.
I think we might. This has just been a fantastic conversation. That, you know, I think some of us are more ready for than others, I have to say. And I know where I fall on that spectrum, but I'll work on it.
Can I mention one thing that we haven't mentioned?
Please.
And that's the connection between thinking and consciousness. I mean, there's a lot of fashion now for cognitive phenomenology. You're aware of your thoughts and their contents, like you're aware of your pains and your after images and your sensations. And what role that plays in it being real thinking. We've been talking as if it's only the propositional attitude stuff, thought contents, that are really relevant to these machines. But if they're not conscious, can they be thinking at all? That's an extra dimension to the other stuff that works. And I think it's worth just mentioning that thought.
Well, maybe that's going to be the title for another discussion, and we'll have you on it out. Real thinking.
But I think the worry is that people think that they think, and that's something we haven't touched on.
Okay. I'm going to have to wind it up. It's been a great discussion, and I think it's going to. I know there's a seminar at Blackfriars tonight. A couple of us are certainly going to be there. I can see this is going to go on a bit more tonight. Anyway, thanks to Howard, Maggie, Maura, and John. Such a terrific discussion today. Thanks also to Sandy for chairing the panel. The next Free Speech Project at the Crossroads International Dialogues event with the Future of Humanities Project will be on Wednesday, March the 19th when we will be discussing how we're going to supply our energy needs for the future, including for AI. How are we going to supply our energy needs for the future? The next Cultural Encounters, Books That Have Made a Difference, will be on Monday, the 24th of February, when Philip Lavender from Gothenburg University will be exploring Icelandic legends and the precursor to Hamlet. It's not the sources of Hamlet, but the precursor legends relating to Hamlet. I think that's going to be absolutely fascinating from a young scholar in Gothenburg. For today, my thanks to colleagues at Georgetown, to Tom Banchoff, the Vice President of Global Affairs, in particular, to John McCabe for all his work, and of course, as ever, to Sandy. At Blackfriars, thanks to Dominic White, the new prior, John O'Connor, the Regent, and Richard Finn, the Director of the Las Casas Institute, and at Campion Hall to Nick Austin, the Master of the Hall. Well, so I'd like to thank all those of you who've asked questions. I'm sorry I didn't get through to all the questions. Guido, you sent in a very long one at the end, and I just couldn't get into that. So thank you very much for sending it in anyway. I'd like to thank everybody who's been here listening to us today, and for all your support of our various series. I'm Professor Mike Scott. I'm Fellow and Senior Dean at Blackfriars Hall, Oxford. You can follow me on Facebook as Michael Kerr Scott, or LinkedIn as Professor Michael Scott. Maybe AI will say it's the same person. I don't know. Until next time, take care and keep safe. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.